NVIDIA just quietly admitted defeat to a hacker with a laptop, and nobody in Cupertino is talking about it. For 7 years, Apple and NVIDIA acted like an ugly divorce that nobody was allowed to bring up at dinner. Back in 2018, Apple ripped NVIDIA's support out of macOS entirely, killed CUDA on Mac stone dead, and told the world they were going all in on their own Metal framework instead. That was the corporate version of a breakup text. No closure, no explanation, just radio silence for the better part of a decade while millions of Mac users sat there with beautiful hardware and zero access to the GPU ecosystem that basically runs the entire AI industry right now. And then, out of absolutely nowhere, a small team called TinyCorp, the same outfit behind George Hotz's TinyGrad project, did something that $2 trillion companies apparently couldn't be bothered to do. They wrote an NVIDIA GPU driver from scratch. No NVIDIA involvement, no Linux dependency. Just a macOS kernel extension that talks directly to the silicon over a Thunderbolt cable, and it actually works. Let that sink in for a second, because this is the part that should be making headlines and isn't. You can now plug a Blackwell series RTX GPU into an Apple Silicon Mac and have it respond to prompts like it's just another piece of the system. Setup took under 5 minutes. You run a curl command, flip on a system extension, install Docker so it can handle compilation, and you're generating text through an NVIDIA card on a machine that was never supposed to talk to NVIDIA again. Tech YouTuber Alex Ziskin tested this live with 3 different cards, a 5060 Ti, a 5070 Ti, and the flagship 50s and 90, plugged into a Mac Mini running an M4 Pro chip with 64 gigs of memory. And what he found tells a much bigger story than cool. It works. It tells you exactly where the real bottleneck in modern computing actually lives, and it's not where you think. Here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable for NVIDIA fans. The RTX 5090 is a monster of a card. On paper, it should demolish anything Apple has ever made in raw compute. But when Ziskin ran the matrix multiplication benchmarks, the M4 Pro's built-in GPU, the one people mock for being just an integrated chip, actually outperformed the RTX 56 Ti in FP32 tests, 33 teraflops versus 22, on a chip that ships inside a computer smaller than a hardcover book. That's not a rounding error. That's a full-blown identity crisis for anyone who's spent the last decade assuming discrete GPUs automatically win every fight. And it gets weirder from there, because when the 5090 finally got tested, its raw matmul numbers actually came in slightly behind the 5070 Ti, a $3,200 flagship card underperforming its little brother on paper. Nobody expected that, least of all Ziskind, who flagged it on camera as a number that just didn't add up. Now here's where the story splits into 2 completely different conversations, and this is where I think most people are going to miss the real headline. When it came to actual token generation, the thing that matters if you're running an LLM locally, the 5090 hit roughly 6 tokens per second, 6, on a card that costs more than most people's rent. And when Ziskind pulled up the memory bandwidth reading during that test, it showed the card operating at around 28 to 33 gigabytes per second. The RTX 5090 is a card capable of 8 terabytes per second of memory bandwidth. It was running at less than 2% of its theoretical ceiling. That's not a hardware problem. That's a software problem so severe it makes the entire card feel decorative. And I think this is the exact moment where casual viewers start assuming the whole project is a bust, when the truth is actually the opposite and way more interesting. Because here's the controversial part nobody wants to say out loud. This entire experiment proves that raw hardware specs have become almost meaningless without mature software behind them. Ziskind ran a direct comparison, the exact same model, exact same settings, just swapping the backend between the new TinyGrad NVIDIA driver and Apple's own battle-tested Metal framework running through llama.cpp. Llama.cpp on Metal was 10 times faster than TinyGrad running on the actual RTX 5090. 10 times. Not twice, not 50%, an entire order of magnitude. Which means right now, today, in this exact moment, Apple's years-old integrated graphics solution is crushing a brand new $3,200 NVIDIA flagship simply because one piece of software has had a decade of obsessive optimization, and the other has had a few months. That's the real story here. And it's the part almost nobody talking about this video is actually processing. Hardware without software maturity is just an expensive paperweight with good marketing. But before you write this whole thing off as a party trick, you need to understand why the driver being slow right now doesn't actually matter as much as you'd think. Because the hard part was never making it fast. The hard part was making it exist at all. Writing a GPU driver from absolute zero, without access to NVIDIA's proprietary source code, without cooperation from either company, targeting a completely different chip architecture than anything NVIDIA officially supports. That's the kind of engineering problem that makes senior developers quietly close their laptops and walk away. TinyCorp didn't just clear that bar, they cleared it in a way that Apple and NVIDIA, two of the most resource-rich companies on the planet, apparently decided wasn't worth their time or their pride. One commenter under the video summed it up in a single sentence that I think nails exactly why this matters. $2 trillion corporations wouldn't do it, and a handful of open-source developers just did. That's not a compliment. That's an indictment. And once you sit with that idea for a second, the bigger picture starts coming into focus. Because this timing is not a coincidence, and I don't care what anyone says. This driver dropped right as Apple was quietly discontinuing the Mac Pro, their last machine that ever offered real internal PCIe expansion for graphics cards. For years, critics said the biggest argument for keeping the Mac Pro alive was GPU compute flexibility for machine learning workloads, and Apple killed it anyway. Right as the exact use case that justified its existence became technically possible again through an external cable. If that's a coincidence, it's an unbelievably cruel one, and it's raised a legitimate, uncomfortable question that a lot of longtime Mac users are now asking publicly. Did Apple discontinue the one machine that could have made this entire breakthrough seamless right before an outside team proved the demand was real? Let's talk bandwidth for a second, because this is where the technical debate gets genuinely fascinating, and most viewers glossed right past it. A lot of people immediately assumed the bottleneck here was Thunderbolt itself. Makes sense on the surface, right? You're running a desktop-class GPU through what's essentially a laptop cable, so obviously that's the choke point. Except it's not. Once a model's weights are loaded into the GPU's own VRAM, and that only happens once, at startup, every single token generated after that stays completely inside the graphics card. The GPU reads from its own memory, computes, writes back to its own memory. The only thing crossing that Thunderbolt cable per token is a handful of bytes. Zyskind explained this clearly, and it's honestly one of the more important technical clarifications buried in this whole story, because it means the real ceiling here isn't cable speed. It's how efficiently TinyGrad's compiler generates GPU instructions. And that's a problem you can fix with better software over time. A 4-lane Thunderbolt bottleneck is a hard physical wall. This is a soft one, and soft walls get knocked down. Now let's talk about what this actually unlocks. Because I think the practical implications got buried under all the benchmark drama. If this driver matures, and given how fast the AI open source community moves right now, that's not a huge if. You're looking at a future where Mac users aren't locked into Apple's unified memory ceiling anymore. Right now, if you want more VRAM on a Mac, you're paying Apple's notoriously brutal upgrade pricing to buy a completely new machine. There's no slotting in more memory later. There's no swapping a GPU. You're stuck with whatever configuration you bought the day you bought it. This driver, even in its rough current state, cracks that door open. Suddenly, a base Mac Mini with modest unified memory could theoretically borrow VRAM from an external NVIDIA card for specific workloads without needing to drop $3,000 or $4,000 on a maxed-out Mac Studio. That's not a small deal. That's a fundamental shift in how people think about scaling AI workloads on Apple hardware, and it's exactly why the comments section under this video exploded with equal parts excitement and confusion. Speaking of the comments, I want to spend a second here because the reaction genuinely tells you as much as the video itself does. Hundreds of people showed up, assuming this was a gaming breakthrough, and the disappointment was almost audible through the screen. Comment after comment asking if it runs Crysis, if it runs Cyberpunk, if it finally means Mac gaming is here. And the answer, over and over, is no. This driver only works inside the TinyGrad framework specifically. It doesn't touch CUDA, it doesn't work with Llama, doesn't work with VLLM, doesn't work with Llama Bot CPP directly, doesn't touch a single game engine. If a specific model architecture or application hasn't been manually written to support TinyGrad, none of this helps you. That disconnect between what people wanted this to be and what it actually is might be the most revealing part of this entire story, because it shows you just how starved the Mac gaming and creative community has been for literally any sign of hope on the GPU front. People weren't reacting to what happened. They were reacting to what they wished had happened. And that desperation isn't irrational, by the way. It's earned. Mac users have watched Apple lean entirely into Metal for almost a decade, while the rest of the industry standardized around DirectX, Vulkan, and CUDA. Developers don't want to build for a walled garden with a fraction of the market share, so games don't come. And because games don't come, Apple doesn't feel pressure to open things up, and the cycle just keeps feeding itself. This driver doesn't break that cycle. Not yet. But it does something almost more important. It proves the technical barrier was never as impossible as everyone assumed. If a handful of open-source developers with no corporate backing can write a working NVIDIA driver for Apple Silicon in their spare time, then the argument that it's just too hard officially stops holding water. The barrier was never technical. It was political. Let's go back to the flip moment for a second, because honestly, it's the most human part of this whole story. At one point during setup, Zyskind literally tosses the RTX 5090 into the air to reorient it before slotting it into the dock. One catch, no drop, moving on like nothing happened. And the comment section absolutely lost it. People calling it a heart attack moment, comparing it to a certain other tech reviewer infamous for mishandling expensive hardware on camera. It's a small moment, but it says something bigger about where we are right now with this hardware. We're talking about graphics cards that cost more than some people's monthly paycheck, being treated casually enough to get flipped through the air on a whim. All in service of proving a point about software drivers most viewers will never personally touch. That's the world AI hardware has built. Ludicrously expensive silicon treated like a toy, chasing performance numbers that are currently being throttled not by the chip, but by code that hasn't caught up yet. So where does this actually go from here? If TinyGrad's team keeps iterating, and there's already chatter in the community about flags like JITbeam that can force the compiler to search harder for efficient kernels, potentially doubling or tripling performance, this 6 tokens per second number becomes a historical footnote pretty fast. The driver existing at all was always the hard part. Speed is just an optimization problem, and optimization problems get solved by exactly the kind of obsessive open-source contributors who already proved they'll do the impossible work Apple and NVIDIA wouldn't touch. The real question isn't whether this gets faster, it's whether Apple lets it. Because right now, Apple approved this driver. They signed it. They let it through their notoriously locked-down security model. Which means either Apple genuinely doesn't see this as a threat to their metal ecosystem, or they've decided it's smarter to let a third party solve a problem they refuse to solve themselves. And that's the real headline buried under all these benchmark charts and token per second numbers. This isn't really a story about an RTX 5090 running slow on a Mac. It's a story about two of the most powerful companies in the world quietly refusing to build something, watching a scrappy independent team build it anyway, and then approving it instead of blocking it. That's not how trillion-dollar companies usually behave when they feel threatened. That's how they behave when they're relieved someone else did the work for them. So maybe the real question isn't whether NVIDIA and Apple will ever officially reconcile. Maybe the real question is whether they even need to anymore, now that a handful of developers just proved the wall between them was never as solid as everyone assumed.
If you enjoy this video, please like, share, subscribe and hit the bell to the later update from my channel. Thank you for watching till the end and see you in the next video.